The film festival as a launch pad, there are essentially three ways in which film festivals work these days as launch pads. One is their talent incubators. And so the big A festivals now have huge talent campuses like at Berlin. Sundance, it just reticulates in so many different ways through workshops and other programs. So a lot of the films that are feeding into and surfacing at places like Sundance are films that have a long DNA chain that trails back through enormous amounts of investment in new talent. It's really dynamic. These are dynamic organizations. Toronto, the same thing. So that's one way, right? The second way is that it's basically, and I always say this about Sundance, and I love it, in some ways, but on the other hand, I've never been to a more mercantile place in my life, because Sundance is not just independent. The idea of independent means that everything and everyone is for sale, right? So it's that thing. So it's the auction block, right? So if anybody remembers the old Key and Peele sketch of the slave auction. That's basically, their very biting, satirical version of the psychology of this kind of turning all independent artists into salespeople of themselves. It does have a bit of that effect, and the market it just goes up and down. As you know, this past Sundance, for example, was an enormous seller's market. With extraordinary minimum guarantees being shelled out by a number of competitive, both specialized divisions and, of course, now the streaming services as market makers, or up until about last week. Obviously there's changes afoot there in terms of the relationship between those services and the independent community we have to keep our eye on. And then the third way in which they are they serve in that function is, of course, just simply as junkets. Where there's just a compressed amount of press that's just there with all eyes, and for a moment you have that attention on you, and you either bank it or you blast out off of it, depending on what your strategy is at the retail level. So I think the festival ecosystem also functions, in a trickle-down way. That's a phrase I don't like to use because I think that it's obviously trickle-down economics is a joke. But there is a way in which inside a particular market sector, you can see the festival logic working on the B and C level to, in essence, gentrify a lot of, there's just so many local festivals. I'm sure almost everybody here has somehow some connection to the whatever, Peoria / whatever festival, right? And some of these are really important cultural events for communities in which they're able to congregate and focus around the nexus, usually in urban areas that have not been paid that much attention to, suddenly are, but more importantly also in rural areas, right? This coming weekend, I think it's this, or is it this? Oh no, it's this past weekend. For example, 2 hours north of New York City and the Hudson Valley, Columbia County, a little town called Chatham, a little village. They've got a single-screen theater that's been there since 1927, and like a lot of other small towns, the theater was going out of business, and the community bought it, and they formed a not-for-profit, and they have a film festival, and they program it, and it has really had an enormous impact on the main street of that village, right? So this kind of, we really pay attention to that structure because it is actually one that probably maintains more of the pulse of the potential for ongoing cinema viewership than we recognize.